forcing the states to borrow even more. As Robin Blackburn wrote in New Left Review, the transfer of debt from private to public hands was carried out in the name of averting systemic failure. But in some ways it aggravated the debt problem, since bank failure, however disruptive, is actually less devastating than state failure. Before long, the bond markets were demanding plans to cut the deficit by slashing public spending and shrinking social protection. So the debt was passed on to the populations, and a third of public debt in Europe today is due to the demands to save the banks. The consequence is, of course, a drastic deterioration in or complete disappearance of welfare services, as is the case in, for instance, Greece, where society is falling apart rather rapidly. So far, the Greek economy has contracted by more than 22%. Workers and pensioners have lost 32% of their income, and unemployment reached an unprecedented 24% in 2014 and has since been at 19%, with youth employment at 55%. The crisis thus grew from a crisis of private capital to a crisis of the state as a guarantee of value. And that might well turn out to be the decisive event. If trust in the state and its currency fails, the situation can escalate rapidly. The images from Berlin in 1923 of wheelbarrows filled with money are of course a nightmare of any state governor or finance minister. In 2011, a popular reaction to the bailout of the banks occurred with the revolts in North Africa and the Middle East, and with the appearance of the place or space or square occupation movement and the occupied movement, which spread from Spain to the US to Israel and onwards. The Arab revolts, in which Western-backed despots like Mubarak and Delali were overthrown, may well turn out to be the beginning of a process that can undermine not just the present neoliberal order, but perhaps capitalism as a social system and as a form of consciousness. That's at least the perspective that the young people in Madrid, Tirana, New York, etc. understand and support. A total challenge to neoliberal capitalism and its extreme inequality, locally and globally. The events of the last 7 years, revolts in North Africa and the Middle East, where Western-backed dictators have been overturned in favor of the development of autonomy for the Arab world, the Occupy movement that refuses to accept the politicians' bailouts of the financial sector and rejects the pretense of parliamentary democracy and its never-failing support for a small finance capitalist elite, wild strikes in Africa and Southeast Asia, where workers protest against extremely bad working conditions and minimal wages. All these events not only show that the world we have and create every day is characterized by extreme inequality and brutal exclusion, they also show that another world is possible. We can change things. As Georg Lukács wrote in 1920, the same process that the bourgeoisie experienced as a permanent crisis and gradual dissolution appears to the proletariat, likewise in crisis form, as the gathering of strength and the springboard to victory. Ideologically, likewise, this means that the same growth of insight into the nature of society, which reflects the protracted death struggle of the bourgeoisie, entails a steady growth in the strength of the proletariat. That the capitalist mode of production is in crisis does of course not necessarily mean that there will be more anti-capitalist resistance. Crisis does not equal revolution, but it does raise some questions about capitalism and its future, because it is obviously becoming more and more difficult to control the basic contradictions of the economic system. More and more violence is needed, and the complete destruction of the planet and most of its inhabitants seems to be the only way to uphold capitalism right now. In this situation, a rupture occurs. The ruling ideology does not function anymore, and the proletariat starts to ask questions and begins to reject the established organization. This takes place at first in spontaneous and uncoordinated ways, but these uncoordinated rejections cross-pollinate, they fuse, linking the protests together, establishing the possibility of a critique of capitalism in its totality. The revolting masses in the Middle East and North Africa, in Europe, in particular France and the US, are all reacting to the intensely aggravated economic and social conditions from which youth in particular is suffering. The statements of support from the different Occupy squares and the banners of the demonstrations testify to this fusion of the protests and to the internationalism of the protest movement. Egypt supports this constant workers, one world, one pain, as it said on one banner. In Cairo, or this Puerta del Sol is Tahrir Square, as it said in Madrid. The protests are as global as the capitalist system they are protesting. Over the past 30 years, neoliberalism have pushed more and more workers out of the reproduction process, dooming them to weightless survival. Weightless survival in complete accordance with Marx's description of the general law of capital accumulation in chapter 23 of the first book of Capital. It's the fundamental contradiction of the capitalist mode of production that workers are at the same time reduced to labor power and excluded from wage labor. Workers are forced to work in order to survive, and at the same time they are unable to get a job, however temporary and miserable, and reproduce their labor power. Capital tries to free itself of labor and thereby digs its own grave. The neoliberal restructuring, 40 years of slow crash landing, the flight from real abstraction to financial speculation and now to crisis capitalism, the neoliberal restructuring is an exclusion of workers. When it comes to the creation of value, a large part of the global working class is simply expendable or superfluous. Already in 1995, when the 500 most important men and women, including Bill Clinton, George Bush, Margaret Thatcher, Bill Gates and Ted Turner got together at the State of the World Forum, this was the scenario. They already knew. As was phrased at the time, 20% of the working age population will be enough in the coming century to keep the world economy going. More manpower won't be needed. What about the others? Will 80% of those willing to work be without a job? The question in the future will be to have lunch or be lunch, to eat or to be devoured. This was in 1995. And remember, this was in the optimistic globalization days of the mid-1990s, when the financial bubble had not burst. Now we are in a situation where the conflicts escalate and are visible to everyone. Things look much darker. As American journalist Chris Hedges writes in his text, "Why the revolution must start in America," I quote, "The game is over. We lost. The corporate state will continue inexorable advance until 2/3 of the nation on the planet is locked into a desperate permanent underclass. Most of us will struggle to make a living while the blank veins and our political elites wallow in the decadence and greed of the forbidden city of Versailles. The elites do not have a vision. They only know one word, money. They only know one word, more. They will continue to exploit the nation, the global economy and the ecosystem, and they will use their money to hide in the gated compounds when it all implodes. Do not expect them to take care of us when it starts to unravel." The reproduction of capital produces what Michael Denning, pupil of Frederick Jameson and Stuart Hall, terms wageless lives. The reproduction of capital produces what Michael Denning terms wageless lives. People that are part of the informal economy have joined the enormous crowd of indefinitely unemployed. According to Mike Davis, we are probably talking about 1 billion people moving back and forth between slums in the cities and the countryside, searching for some kind of temporary work. Now the 80% are simply superfluous and excluded from production because capital only buys living labor if it's able to valorize it at an efficient rate of profit. Because of this development, slum cities all over the world are growing, and increasing numbers of people are becoming redundant to the accumulation of capital and entering what Marx termed the sphere of pauperization. This is of course not an objective limit, the last crisis of capitalism. It's not, but something has happened. More and more people's lives are unbearable, and the revolts and revolutions in the Middle East have established a perspective that points beyond capitalism, outside of capitalism. This is the context. And this of course means that the question of the avant-garde naturally returns. Outside of or beyond the system internal challenges and participatory engaging spectacles of 1990s art, so-called relational aesthetics, in which democracy and the market were rarely questioned, it's again becoming possible to envisage artistic experiments that keep the revolutionary perspective in view and are associated with a radical transformation of the world. We've already seen art play a role in the revolts in Tunisia and Egypt, and in the protest movements in Europe and the US, echoing historical moments in the past where artists joined forces with the revolution. In Tunis and in Cairo, we've seen a return of a kind of Tahir Dada in the form of a sneering art of provocation that ridicules the church, the mosque and the dictator, all the while self-critically investigating what a revolutionary process is, including the question of mental inertia, to which the Situationists devoted so much attention in the 60s. Graffiti in particular has played a role in the events in Egypt and the streets, where it has both emphasized the demands of the revolutionaries, honored dead martyrs, and mocked the ruling powers. The first examples were often basic anti-Mubarak words, step back, or graffiti against the police, ACAP, or cops are bastards, often readable not only on walls but also on tanks and police cars. Later came regular wall paintings where Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak and Tantawi were pictures as one person with different masks, or with the heads of Tantawi and other leading members of the military council were pictured as urinal stones. Artist spaces and publishing houses have also played an important role in Cairo and elsewhere as gathering places for revolutionaries and as the beginning of a new alternative public sphere. From the start, Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Oakland were characterized by a creative critical gesture, where the division of public space was important. From the occupation of Sukoti Park, renamed Liberty Square, the erection of a Tahrir-inspired tent camp in the middle of the financial district of Manhattan, the use of a so-called people's microphone, to the projection of Occupy slogans on the 32-floor Verizon building in Lower Manhattan. Occupy Wall Street used post-situationist devices where urban space became the object of creative interventions that questioned the layout of the city and made visible alternative ways of organizing it beyond the constraints of a neoliberal city council, the political system, and its police. From the beginning, parts of the progressive art milieu played an important role in the creation of Occupy Wall Street. It was the magazine Adbuster, which, following an article by David Graeber entitled Awaiting the Magical Spark, about the possibility of using Tahrir Square as a model for critique. After that article, the magazine Adbuster called for the occupation of Wall Street in the 70th of September 2011. At the same time, the art activist space 16 Beaver in Brooklyn had arranged a series of meetings with the purpose of staging or starting a public protest movement in New York. Adbuster's call and 16 Beaver's preparations formed a synthesis diffused with the occupation of Zuccotti Park and the establishment of a general assembly following the experiments of Spain. A subgroup of Occupy Wall Street called Arts and Labor, inspired by the Art Workers Coalition and their activities in the late 1960s. Art Workers Coalition, they protested against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s and staged different kinds of blockades at Guggenheim and Rome, etc. A subgroup of Occupy Wall Street called Arts and Labor intervened in the art world by pointing out the links between the Whitney Museum of American Art, MoMA, and a number of banks and finance companies that have played a central role in the introduction of high-risk loan models. Arts and Labor also actively supported the Sotheby's workers organized in the Teamsters who had been fired in 2011. In connection with the Whitney Biennial 2012, the group created a fake Whitney homepage announcing that Whitney has stopped the collaboration with two sponsors, Sotheby's and Deutsche Bank. The Whitney, I quote, will find a way to open the 2012 biennial in spite of the museum's difficult decision to break with two major corporate sponsors of the biennial. Last year saw record-breaking sales with profit over 100 million for Sotheby's. The pay of the CEO alone doubled to 6 million. Yet Sotheby's have sought to break organized labor by starving their workers into submission, locked out of their jobs and without wages since August. The Whitney also announces its break with the major sponsor Deutsche Bank, which is facing numerous lawsuits and accusations of fraud from both investors and the US government. The reckless and even fraudulent financial speculation by banks like Deutsche Bank has created enormous social costs in terms of lost jobs, savings and homes. So this was a fake news announcement stating that the museum would end its collaboration with Sotheby's and Deutsche Bank. At the opening of the biennial, art workers also demonstrated outside the museum denouncing Whitney's collaboration with Sotheby's and Deutsche Bank. They hacked the homepage of Whitney announcing museum breaks with two corporate sponsors and apologized. The actions of Arts and Labor are highly relevant, but it's probably the extra or anti-institutional initiatives, in other words, the explicit break with the art system, that will prove most relevant. In the coming struggles. It is in the transcendence of the institutional framework that the avant-garde position is established and endowed with an anti-capitalist perspective. It may therefore be counterproductive to focus solely on art and culture as Arts and Labor tends to do. It's probably in the creative protests on the streets and online, in other words, in the margins of the art institution or outside the art institution, that the most important, in square quotes, artistic contributions take place. It's in the supersession of art, theory, media and politics as separate disciplines that the revolutionary perspective manifests itself, as has been the case in previous historical situations where art has expanded its domain and created thought experiments as an integral part of the mobilization of the proletariat. This has been the case from Rambaud to the Situationist and Bayonne. In other words, perhaps the avant-garde and its radical critique is still possible. Perhaps the avant-garde is still with us.
Thank you. So we great. Maybe we do we want a break or take a break or we continue on? Huh?
Do you guys want?
Huh? We can continue our discussion or take a break. Hmm?
Maybe a 5-minute break?
5 minutes break.
Yeah.
Just a brief break. Okay. Yeah.